What would you risk if tomorrow morning someone could legally tear you from your mother's arms forever, and the only weapon you had was your mind? Before we dive into this extraordinary tale of courage and intelligence, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss stories of resilience that history tried to bury but could never truly silence. The Virginia tobacco fields stretched endlessly under the oppressive heat of July 1851, their broad green leaves concealing both the bitter labor of hundreds of enslaved souls and the sharp mind of a boy who would outsmart the entire system designed to break him. His name was Isaac, and at 12 years old he possessed something that terrified every slaveholder who took the time to notice: an intelligence so keen, so observant, so relentlessly calculating that it made him dangerous in ways no whip or chain could ever contain. Isaac had been born on the Holloway plantation to parents who had given him two precious gifts: his father Benjamin's analytical mind that could solve any mechanical problem, and his mother's Sarah's photographic memory that forgot nothing, not a face, not a conversation, not a single detail that might someday prove useful. The Holloway plantation was one of the largest in Henrico County, stretching across 3,000 acres of prime Virginia soil, worked by 247 enslaved people who existed in a carefully maintained hell of calculated cruelty and strategic kindness. Master Richard Holloway prided himself on being a progressive slaveholder, which meant he permitted Sunday worship, allowed enslaved families to remain together when profitable, and only used the whip when he deemed it absolutely necessary for discipline. What made Holloway particularly dangerous was his intelligence. He understood that the most effective slavery wasn't maintained purely through violence, but through psychological control, through creating systems where the enslaved policed themselves, where hope was rationed like food, where resistance seemed not just dangerous, but impossible. Isaac had learned to read in secret, taught by his mother Sarah, who had been taught by a previous mistress's daughter before that young woman died of fever and the lessons abruptly stopped. Reading was forbidden to enslaved people in Virginia, punishable by whipping or worse, but Sarah had understood that literacy was a form of freedom, a window into a world beyond bondage. She had taught Isaac using a tattered Bible stolen from the main house, teaching him letters traced in dirt, words whispered in darkness, sentences that opened his mind to possibilities his body could not yet reach. By age 8, Isaac could read better than many white children twice his age. By 10, he was reading newspapers that the overseer discarded, learning about the wider world, about the debates over slavery, about places in the North where people who looked like him walked as free citizens. But knowledge brought its own form of torment. The more Isaac understood about the world beyond the plantation, the more unbearable his captivity became. He watched his father, Benjamin, work in the plantation's blacksmith shop, his brilliant mechanical mind reduced to shoeing horses and repairing tools, never able to invent or create or build the things Isaac knew he was capable of. He watched his mother, Sarah, serve in the main house, her dignity intact despite the daily humiliations, her intelligence visible in her eyes, even as she was forced to pretend stupidity to avoid threatening the white family she served. And Isaac learned. He learned everything. He learned the patterns of the overseer's rounds, which ones drank themselves into stupor and which ones remained vigilant through the night. He learned the geography of the plantation, every path through the woods, every creek and hiding place. He learned the psychology of the enslaved community, who could be trusted absolutely, who might inform to gain favor, who existed in that gray area of survival where loyalty shifted like sand. He learned the economics of slavery, listening to conversations not meant for his ears, understanding that enslaved people were investments, property with calculated value, and that this financial logic created both vulnerabilities and opportunities. What Isaac didn't know, what he couldn't have known on that sultry July morning as he worked alongside his father in the blacksmith shop, was that the fragile stability of his family was about to shatter in the most devastating way possible, and that the response he chose would set in motion a chain of events that would test every ounce of his intelligence, courage, and cunning. Could any 12-year-old truly be prepared for what was coming? Could any amount of intelligence or learning protect him from the cruelty that was about to be unleashed? The news came not with warning, but with the brutal efficiency that characterized slavery's worst moments. A slave trader named Josiah Marks arrived at the plantation in a covered wagon designed to transport human cargo, and with him came the end of Isaac's childhood. Master Holloway had suffered financial setbacks, a bad tobacco crop, debts to Richmond merchants, gambling losses that had accumulated over years of careless spending. The solution, as it always was in the slave economy, was to sell human beings to cover the deficit. And the most valuable human beings on any plantation were skilled laborers and their families, people who could be separated and sold to different buyers to maximize profit. Isaac's father, Benjamin, was worth $1,500, a master blacksmith whose skills were in high demand across the South. His mother, Sarah, was worth $1,000, an experienced house servant, still young enough for years of service, educated enough to be valuable in a refined household. And Isaac himself, at 12, showing his father's mechanical aptitude and his mother's quick intelligence, was worth $800 to a buyer looking for a slave who could be trained for skilled work. Together, they represented $3,300, a fortune that could solve Master Holloway's immediate financial problems. Separated, they could be sold to 3 different buyers, each getting exactly what they wanted, while Holloway pocketed the full value without the sentimentality of keeping families together. The decision had been made. The trader was here. The sale would happen within 3 days. Isaac learned this not from any official announcement, but from eavesdropping on a conversation between the plantation overseer, a cruel man named Silas Whitmore, and his assistant. He was carrying firewood past the overseer's office when he heard Whitmore say, "The blacksmith and his wife are prime stock, but Holloway wants to sell them separate, more profit that way. The boy goes to a trainer in South Carolina, one of those operations that breaks young ones into field work, should fetch a good price." The words hit Isaac like physical blows. South Carolina, separation, different buyers. The casual tone in which Whitmore discussed the destruction of his family as if they were livestock being sent to different markets made Isaac's blood run cold. But even as terror threatened to overwhelm him, his analytical mind began working, processing, calculating. 3 days. He had 3 days to do something that thousands of enslaved families had tried and failed to do: keep his family together and escape the system designed to prevent exactly that. 3 days to outsmart men who had guns, dogs, legal authority, and centuries of practice in preventing escapes. 3 days for a 12-year-old boy to accomplish what seemed impossible. Isaac didn't run immediately to his parents with this information. Instead, he did what his mother had taught him. He thought, he observed, he planned. Because the difference between successful escapes and failed ones wasn't courage. Plenty of brave souls had died trying to run. The difference was strategy, timing, preparation, and the kind of careful planning that left nothing to chance. That night, lying on his pallet in the small cabin his family shared, Isaac pretended to sleep while his mind raced through possibilities and problems. Running was the obvious choice, but running where? The plantation was in central Virginia, nearly 300 miles from the north. They had no money, no papers, no contacts with the Underground Railroad that helped fugitives north. They had no supplies, no weapons, no realistic chance of outrunning professional slave catchers with trained dogs. But what if they didn't run north? What if the assumption that fugitives always headed north could be used against the people hunting them? What if Isaac's knowledge of the plantation, his understanding of how the system worked, could create an opportunity that didn't yet exist? The beginnings of a plan formed in his mind, audacious, risky, requiring perfect timing and nerves of steel, but possible, just barely possible. Could a 12-year-old boy really orchestrate an escape that would fool experienced slave catchers? Could his intelligence overcome the massive advantages his enemies possessed? The next morning, Isaac began laying the groundwork for his plan with a subtlety that would have impressed even the most cunning adult. His first step was information gathering. He needed to know exactly when the sale would happen, who the buyers were, and what route the trader would take when leaving the plantation. This information was closely guarded, but Isaac had learned that adults often spoke freely around children they considered too young to understand or too powerless to matter. He volunteered to help serve meals in the overseer's office, a task usually given to older enslaved people, but one that Whitmore's wife appreciated having help with. As Isaac carried trays of food, emptied chamber pots, and swept floors, he kept his ears open and his expression blank, playing the role of the invisible servant that white people expected. He learned that Josiah Marks, the slave trader, had 3 other plantations to visit in the area before heading south to the Richmond slave markets. He learned that Benjamin would be sold to a plantation owner in North Carolina who needed a blacksmith. He learned that Sarah would be sold to a wealthy merchant family in Petersburg who wanted an experienced house servant. And he learned that he himself would be sold to a slave breaker in South Carolina, a man who specialized in taking young enslaved boys and breaking their spirits through brutal labor and systematic cruelty, preparing them for lives in the cotton fields. Each piece of information was a puzzle piece. Isaac assembled them in his mind, looking for the pattern that would reveal an opportunity. The sale was scheduled for 3 days hence, on Saturday morning. Marks would take possession of all 3 of them, transport them to Richmond in his wagon, and from there they would be dispersed to their separate fates. The entire transaction would be completed in less than a week, and Isaac's family would be permanently destroyed, unless Isaac could prevent it. His mother, Sarah, noticed the change in him that evening. As they sat outside their cabin after the day's work was done, she studied his face with the penetrating gaze that had always seen through his attempts at deception. "You know something," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the evening sounds of the quarters. "I can see it in your eyes, baby. What do you know?" Isaac hesitated. Telling his parents would mean involving them in whatever he planned, putting them at risk if his scheme failed. But keeping them ignorant would mean acting without their knowledge or consent, treating them like children rather than partners. He made his decision quickly. His parents deserved to know the truth, and more importantly, he needed their help. "They're selling us," he whispered. "Saturday morning, to different buyers. Father to North Carolina, you to Petersburg, me to South Carolina. We'll never see each other again." Sarah's face crumpled, years of suppressed grief and fear finally breaking through her careful composure. Benjamin, sitting nearby and whittling a piece of wood with hands that could shape metal but couldn't protect his family, stopped moving entirely, the knife frozen in his powerful grip. "How do you know this?" Benjamin asked, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. Isaac told them everything he'd learned, and then, taking a deep breath, he told them his plan. It was audacious. It was dangerous. It had a dozen points where everything could go catastrophically wrong. But it was a chance, and a chance was more than most enslaved families ever got when faced with separation. "You want to do what?" Sarah breathed, her eyes wide with equal parts terror and admiration for her son's boldness. "I want us to disappear," Isaac said simply. "Not run, disappear. Make them think we escaped when we're actually still here. hide right under their noses while they search for us elsewhere. Then, when the chaos dies down and they stop looking, we actually escape." Gemini shook his head slowly. "Boy, that's the craziest thing I ever heard. It'll never work." "It might," Isaac insisted. "It might work because it's crazy, because they'll never expect it, because everyone assumes fugitives run as far and fast as possible. We do the opposite." Sarah looked at her son with new eyes, seeing not the child she'd borne, but the brilliant, desperate young man he was becoming. "Tell us the whole plan, every detail, and then we'll decide together." But did they really have a choice? Was any plan, no matter how risky, better than the certainty of permanent separation? Isaac's plan relied on several key observations he'd made about the plantation's operations and the psychology of slave catchers. First, when enslaved people escaped, there was a predictable response: immediate pursuit with dogs, searching the surrounding woods, alerts sent to neighboring plantations, and patrol of roads heading north. The entire response was based on the assumption that enslaved fugitives would try to put as much distance from themselves and the plantation as quickly as possible. Second, the plantation had several buildings and areas that were rarely visited. Old tobacco barns at the edge of the property that had been abandoned when Holloway shifted to different crops. A section of swampy woodland that was too wet for cultivation and too dense for easy passage, and a network of root cellars and storage areas that were checked infrequently except during harvest season. Third, and most importantly, Isaac had noticed that Master Holloway and Overseer Whitmore had a particular blind spot. They assumed that enslaved people, especially children, lacked the intelligence and planning capability for sophisticated deception. They expected brute resistance or desperate flight, not calculated strategy. Isaac's plan exploited all of these factors. On Friday night, the night before the sale, Isaac and his parents would stage a disappearance that looked like a traditional escape attempt. They would leave obvious signs of flight, disturbed earth near the quarters suggesting hasty departure, a stolen knife missing from the kitchen, their few belongings apparently taken. These clues would trigger the expected response: pursuit, dogs, searches focused on routes north. But instead of running north, they would hide in the last place anyone would look, in one of the abandoned tobacco barns at the far edge of the plantation, a building that was scheduled for demolition but hadn't yet been torn down. Isaac had explored it weeks ago and found that the interior had a space beneath the floorboards, originally designed for storing seed tobacco in cool darkness. The space was cramped, airless, and filled with the musty smell of old tobacco, but it was large enough for 3 people to hide, and it had a small ventilation gap that would prevent them from suffocating. They would hide there while the plantation erupted in chaos, while dogs tracked false trails, while slave catchers searched roads and woods. They would remain absolutely silent, absolutely still, for as long as it took for the initial frenzy to die down. Isaac estimated at least 3 days, possibly as long as a week. During this time, they would have no food, except what they could smuggle into the hiding place beforehand. They would have no water, except a single jug. They would have no sanitation, no light, no comfort. They would be gambling that they could endure this suffering long enough for the search to be called off, for Marks to leave without his purchased property, for the plantation to return to something resembling normal operations. Then, and only then, they would actually escape. But not north. That's where the search would be focused. Instead, they would head south and east, toward the coast, where Isaac had learned from newspapers that there were communities of free black people, where ship captains sometimes took fugitives aboard vessels heading north, where the Underground Railroad had connections that reached even into the heart of slave territory.
"It's insane," Benjamin said after hearing the full plan. "We could die in that hiding place. We could be discovered. Even if we make it through the hiding, the actual escape could fail." "True," Isaac acknowledged, But what's certain is that if we do nothing, we'll be separated forever. I'll be sent to a slave breaker who'll try to destroy everything you and Mama taught me. You'll spend the rest of your life shoeing horses for a North Carolina master. Mama will spend hers serving a Petersburg merchant family. We'll never see each other again. Never. Is that better than trying?" Sarah reached out and took both her son's hands and her husband's hands, forming a circle of 3. "I have lived my whole life as property," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I've endured things I won't speak of. I've survived by being obedient, by being invisible, by never challenging the system. But I cannot let them take my son. I cannot let them destroy this family without a fight. If Isaac's plan gives us even a chance, even a small one, I say we take it." Benjamin looked at his wife, then at his son, and in their faces he saw a determination that matched his own. "Then we do it. We plan every detail, we prepare everything we can, and we do it together." The decision was made. A 12-year-old boy, his mother, and his father were about to attempt something that would either save their family or destroy them all. Could they really pull it off? Could Isaac's intelligence overcome the massive structural advantages of the slave system? The next 24 hours were a masterclass in careful preparation disguised as normal behavior. Isaac, Sarah, and Benjamin went about their assigned tasks with no visible change in demeanor, but every moment they could steal they used to prepare for what was coming. Sarah, who worked in the main house kitchen, managed to smuggle out dried cornmeal, strips of dried meat, and a small jar of preserves, not enough to sustain them for long, but enough to keep them alive during the hiding period. She hid these items in a cloth sack that she buried near the tobacco barn during an evening walk that appeared to be nothing more than an enslaved woman taking air after a long day's work. Benjamin, working in the blacksmith shop, created several tools that might prove useful. A small pry bar that could be hidden in clothing, a sharpened piece of metal that could serve as a weapon of last resort, and a makeshift compass using a magnetized nail and a piece of cork that could float in water. He also carefully studied the plantation's perimeter, noting where the fencing was weakest, where patrols were least frequent, where the land provided natural cover for anyone trying to slip away unseen. Isaac, for his part, continued to serve in the overseer's office, gathering final pieces of information while also planting subtle false clues that would support their deception. He mentioned casually to another enslaved boy that he'd heard talk of running north to Richmond, where they say there's folks who help runaways. He knew this boy had a history of informing to the overseers in exchange for better treatment, a betrayal born of survival rather than malice. The information would reach Whitmore, who would remember it when the escape happened and factor it into his search strategy. Isaac also took careful note of the weather. Rain was predicted for Friday night. He'd heard the overseer's wife mention it to her husband, warning him to make sure the horses were sheltered. Rain would make their escape more miserable, but would also help cover their tracks and make it harder for dogs to follow scent trails. On Friday afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the Virginia hills, Isaac made a final check of the tobacco barn where they would hide. He'd visited it 3 times over the past weeks, always finding excuses for being in that area of the plantation, collecting firewood, searching for wild herbs that his mother used for cooking, exploring as children were allowed to do in their brief moments of freedom. He'd learned every board, every shadow, every sound the building made when wind pushed against its weathered walls. The hiding space beneath the floorboards was accessed through a loose section of planking that appeared firmly nailed, but actually could be lifted if you knew where to push. The space beneath was about 4 feet high, 10 feet long, and 6 feet wide, cramped for 3 people, but survivable. Isaac had already placed a piece of canvas there to lie on, keeping them off the damp earth.
The ventilation gap he'd discovered was a crack between the foundation stones, barely 3 inches wide, but sufficient to allow airflow that would prevent them from suffocating. He'd also created a false trail leading away from the barn. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, signs that would suggest someone had passed through the woods toward the north road. These signs were subtle enough that they wouldn't be noticed immediately, but obvious enough that dogs and experienced trackers would find them during a search. Everything was ready, everything in place. Now came the hardest part, waiting for darkness, acting normal, giving no sign that anything unusual was about to happen. That evening, as enslaved families gathered for their meager suppers, as children played in the brief time before sleep, as the plantation settled into the rhythms of another day of bondage ending, Isaac sat with his parents one final time in their cabin. They didn't speak of the plan. Walls were thin and ears were everywhere, but they sat close, touching hands, drawing strength from each other. Sarah sang softly, an old spiritual that carried coded meaning for those who understood. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water.
The song had been used for generations to convey escape instructions, the water reference a reminder to walk through streams to throw off tracking dogs. Benjamin held his son's hand, this boy who had grown up too fast, who carried burdens no child should carry, who was about to attempt something that would either save them all or doom them to fates worse than what they currently faced. And Isaac, for the first time in days, allowed himself to feel the fear he'd been suppressing beneath layers of planning and strategy. He was 12 years old. He was about to lead his family into mortal danger based on a plan he'd devised himself, with no adult confirmation that it made sense, no experienced guide to say whether his calculations were sound. What if he was wrong? What if his intelligence wasn't enough? What if he led his parents to disaster? But then he remembered why they were doing this. He remembered the casual cruelty in Overseer Whitmore's voice as he discussed selling them separately. He remembered every story his mother had told him about families torn apart, children sold away from parents, husbands separated from wives, the systematic destruction of love and connection that was slavery's most profound evil. And he knew that even if his plan failed, trying was better than accepting that fate without resistance. Could any of them have known, as darkness fell on that July night, how close they would come to both success and disaster in the hours ahead? They moved at midnight, when the plantation had settled into the deepest sleep, when even the most vigilant overseers had succumbed to exhaustion or whiskey. The moon was hidden behind gathering storm clouds. The predicted rain was coming, right on schedule. Isaac led the way, moving with a silence his father had taught him during hunting trips where enslaved men were occasionally allowed to supplement their meager rations with wild game. Sarah followed, her house servants training and moving quietly through the master's home, serving her well now. Benjamin brought the rear, his blacksmith's powerful frame somehow making no sound as he navigated the darkness. They carried nothing except the clothes on their backs and the small bundles of supplies they'd hidden earlier. Carrying luggage would make them visible targets if they were spotted, would slow them down, would make the deception less believable. The supplies they'd cached near the tobacco barn would have to be sufficient. The route Isaac had planned avoided the main paths between the slave quarters and the plantation's work areas. Instead, they moved through gardens, along the edge of the tree line, through spaces where shadows were deepest. Every few feet, Isaac would pause, listening for any sound of patrols, any indication they'd been spotted.
His heart hammered so loudly in his chest he was certain everyone on the plantation must hear it.
They passed the main house, a massive structure that represented everything they were fighting against: the wealth built on their labor, the comfort purchased with their suffering, the legal system that defined them as property rather than people. Lights were out except for one window on the second floor, where Master Holloway apparently still worked on his account books, calculating profits and losses, in which human beings were nothing more than numbers. They reached the edge of the cultivated areas and entered the woods, moving now with slightly more speed, but still maintaining absolute silence. The woods were alive with night sounds: owls hunting, small animals rustling through undergrowth, wind moving through leaves. These sounds provided cover for any small noises they made, but they also made it harder to hear approaching danger. 20 minutes into their journey, disaster nearly struck. A patrol passed nearby. 2 white men hired to watch for escapes, moving along the plantation's perimeter with a lantern and a dog. Isaac, Sarah, and Benjamin pressed themselves against the ground behind a fallen log, barely breathing, praying the dog wouldn't catch their scent. The animal paused, sniffing the air, and for a terrible moment Isaac was certain they'd been discovered. But the wind was blowing from the patrol toward them, carrying their scent away rather than toward the dog. The animal lost interest, and the patrol moved on, the men complaining about having to work in weather that threatened rain. They remained motionless for another 5 minutes after the patrol passed, ensuring it wasn't a trick, ensuring they were truly alone again. Then they rose and continued, moving faster now, aware that they were racing against time and luck. They reached the abandoned tobacco barn 40 minutes after leaving their cabin. The structure loomed dark and skeletal against the clouded sky, its weathered wood creaking in the rising wind. Isaac led them around to the side entrance he'd identified earlier, a door that was technically locked, but whose lock had rusted through, making it openable with careful pressure. Inside, the darkness was absolute. They didn't dare light a candle or lamp. Any light might be visible through cracks in the walls. Instead, they navigated by feel and memory, Isaac leading them to the spot where the loose floorboards concealed their hiding place. Benjamin pried up the boards using the tool he'd forged, revealing the dark space beneath. Sarah retrieved the supplies they'd cached earlier, passing them down into the hiding space. Then came the moment of truth. They had to climb down into that confined darkness and pull the boards back over themselves, sealing themselves into what could become either their salvation or their tomb. Sarah went first, her smaller frame fitting more easily into the cramped space. Benjamin followed, his bulk making the space even tighter.
Isaac came last, pulling the floorboards back into place below him with a technique he'd practiced during his earlier visits. The boards settled with a soft thump that sounded catastrophically loud in the silence, but which Isaac knew wouldn't carry beyond the barn's walls. They were in. They were hidden. Phase 1 of the plan was complete. Now came the hardest part, waiting in absolute darkness and silence while the world above them erupted in chaos. But would their hiding place be as secure as Isaac calculated? Would the ventilation be sufficient? Would their nerve hold under the psychological pressure of confinement? The first hour was the worst. The hiding space was smaller than it had seemed during Isaac's earlier explorations, or perhaps it was just that having 3 people crammed into it made every dimension feel more constrained. The ceiling, the underside of the barn's floorboards, was barely 4 feet high, meaning they couldn't sit fully upright. The walls were damp earth that smelled of rot and tobacco residue. The ventilation gap let in air, but also let in the sounds of the night, amplified and distorted in the confined space, so that every creak of the barn's timbers sounded like approaching footsteps. They arranged themselves as comfortably as possible, Sarah and Isaac side by side with their backs against one earth wall, Benjamin positioned slightly apart to maximize the space. They didn't speak, knowing that voices could carry in unpredictable ways, that even whispers might be audible to someone passing nearby. Instead, they held hands in the darkness, physical touch their only communication, their only comfort. Isaac's mind raced through his plan, checking and rechecking every step. Had he left enough false clues to suggest a northward escape attempt? Had he concealed the entrance to their hiding place sufficiently? Would the cached supplies be enough to sustain them through the days of hiding that lay ahead? Each question spawned others, creating a spiral of worry that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. Sarah, sensing her son's tension through the hand she held, squeezed gently, a mother's reassurance that needed no words. Benjamin shifted slightly, his presence solid and protective even in the disorienting darkness. Above them, the storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke. Rain hammered against the barn's roof with a sound like 1,000 drums, and Isaac felt a surge of relief. The rain would wash away any tracks they'd left, would make the scent trail harder for dogs to follow, would make the search that would inevitably come more difficult and less effective. Nature itself seemed to be conspiring to help them. The rain continued for hours, sometimes diminishing to a drizzle, sometimes intensifying to a downpour that leaked through the barn's damaged roof and created a pattern of drips that they could hear hitting the floor above them.
The temperature dropped, and they huddled together for warmth, their bodies the only source of heat in the damp cold of the hiding space. Sarah eventually dozed, her head resting on Isaac's shoulder, exhaustion overcoming fear and discomfort. Benjamin remained awake, his breathing steady and controlled, a soldier on guard, even though there was nothing he could do if they were discovered. Isaac tried to sleep, but found it impossible, his mind too active, his senses too attuned to every sound and sensation. He thought about what would happen in the morning when their absence was discovered. Whitmore would come to their cabin to bring them to the sale. He would find them gone, their few possessions apparently taken, signs of hasty departure. He would immediately sound the alarm, wake the plantation, organize a search party. Dogs would be brought in, neighboring plantations alerted, patrols sent to watch roads and river crossings. And with luck, with God's blessing, with the rain continuing to cover their tracks, the searchers would be led north and west by the false clues Isaac had planted, would waste days searching in the wrong direction while 3 people hid mere yards from the plantation's main buildings. It was audacious. It was risky. It was the kind of plan that most enslaved people would never attempt because the consequences of failure were too terrible to contemplate. But it was also, Isaac believed, their only real chance. As dawn approached and gray light began to filter through the ventilation gap, bringing the first dim illumination to their hiding place, Isaac heard what he'd been waiting for. Shouting voices, the barking of dogs, the sounds of organized chaos as the plantation woke to the news of their escape. The hunt had begun. Could 3 people remain absolutely silent, absolutely hidden, while armed men and trained dogs searched for them? Could Isaac's plan withstand the test of actual implementation? The sounds from above and around them told a story more vivid than any direct observation could have provided. Isaac listened, interpreting each noise, each snippet of conversation that carried to their hiding place. Whitmore's voice, raised in fury, demanding to know how 3 slaves had escaped without anyone noticing. The plantation bell ringing to summon all enslaved workers to an emergency gathering, a standard procedure when escapes occurred, both to take count of who remained and to make an example that would discourage others from similar attempts.
dogs barking with the excitement of the hunt, their handlers struggling to control them as they picked up scent trails from the slave quarters and followed them. Which direction? Isaac strained to hear, to determine if his false trails were working as intended. The sound of the dogs seemed to move north and west, exactly as he'd hoped.
The rain had complicated the scent tracking, but the false clues he'd planted had apparently been sufficient to guide the dogs in the desired direction. Hours passed. The initial chaos of discovery gave way to the systematic organization of a search. Isaac heard horse hooves, riders being sent to neighboring plantations, to the sheriff in the county seat, to professional slave catchers who made their living hunting fugitives. He heard Josiah Marks, the slave trader, shouting threats about the money he'd be losing if his purchased property wasn't recovered. He heard Master Holloway's voice, tighter and more controlled than Whitmore's, but equally angry, making it clear that this escape was a personal affront that demanded severe consequences when the fugitives were recaptured. When, not if. Their certainty that Isaac and his parents would be found was absolute, an arrogance born of centuries of successful slave control, of a system that seemed designed to make escape impossible. But that certainty was also a weakness. It meant they wouldn't think to search thoroughly close to home, wouldn't imagine that fugitives might hide rather than run, wouldn't consider that a 12-year-old enslaved boy might be capable of the kind of strategic thinking that even educated white men struggled with. The day dragged on with agonizing slowness. The hiding space, which had seemed merely uncomfortable in the darkness of night, became unbearable in the gray light of day. The air was close and fetid, making breathing difficult. The cold dampness seeped into their bones, creating an ache that no amount of shifting positions could alleviate. They'd eaten nothing since the previous evening, and drank only sparingly from their single jug of water, knowing they had to make it last. Worst of all was the psychological torture of forced immobility and silence. Sarah, who had dozed during the night, was now awake and struggling with the confined space in a way that Isaac could sense through the tension in her body. Benjamin shifted occasionally, trying to find positions that wouldn't cause his muscles to cramp, but every movement had to be slow and silent, turned into an agonizing exercise in self-control. And Isaac, who had designed this plan, who had brought his parents to this miserable hiding place, carried the weight of responsibility for their suffering. If they were discovered, it would be because of his miscalculation. If they died here, from suffocation, from discovery and execution, from any of the dozen ways this plan could fail, it would be his fault. But he couldn't afford to indulge in guilt or doubt. He had to remain alert, had to listen to the sounds from outside, had to be ready to respond if circumstances changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. Afternoon brought new sounds.
A search party passed close to the tobacco barn, close enough that Isaac could hear the individual voices of the men, could distinguish between the overseer Whitmore's commands and the responses of the enslaved men who'd been forced to join the search, required to hunt their own people under threat of punishment. The footsteps came nearer. A voice said, "What about that old tobacco barn? Should we check inside?" Isaac's heart stopped. This was a contingency he'd planned for but hoped wouldn't occur. If they searched the barn thoroughly, if they pried up floorboards, if they discovered the hiding place. "That place?" Whitmore's voice, dismissive and certain. "It's scheduled for demolition. Nothing in there but rot and rats. They ran north. The dogs picked up their trail heading toward the river. We're wasting time here." The footsteps moved away. The voices faded. Isaac, Sarah, and Benjamin remained frozen in place for another hour, not daring to relax, not trusting that the danger had truly passed. But gradually the sounds of the search became more distant. The plantation settled into a new rhythm, normal work resuming, but with an underlying tension, with patrols continuing, with everyone aware that 3 slaves remained unaccounted for. Night fell again, bringing relief from the heat that had built in the barn during the day, but also bringing new discomforts as the temperature dropped. They ate a small amount of the dried food Sarah had cached, chewing slowly to make it last, washing it down with careful sips of water. They didn't speak, still not trusting the silence, still aware that any sound could betray them. Isaac's back ached from sitting in cramped positions. His legs had fallen asleep twice, the pins and needles sensation almost unbearable in the darkness. His stomach cramped from hunger and from the stress of constant vigilance. But he also felt a grim satisfaction. They'd survived the first full day. The search had focused elsewhere, just as he'd predicted. The plan was working. But could it continue to work? How long could they endure these conditions before illness, injury, or simple desperation forced them to abandon the hiding place? The second day brought new challenges and a development Isaac hadn't anticipated. The search continued, but with less intensity. Some of the searchers had apparently given up and gone home, convinced that the fugitives were miles away by now. But Whitmore, whose reputation depended on maintaining absolute control over the plantation, wasn't ready to quit. Isaac could hear him throughout the day, organizing renewed search efforts, questioning enslaved workers about anything suspicious they might have seen, making it clear that the entire slave community would suffer consequences until the escapees were found. This was a calculated cruelty that Isaac knew about but hadn't fully considered in his planning.
In response to escapes, masters often punished the entire enslaved community, reduced rations, extra work, arbitrary whippings, creating social pressure for fugitives to return or for other enslaved people to betray them. Isaac's escape wasn't just affecting his own family, but every person on the plantation. The knowledge created a new kind of guilt. People he'd known his entire life, children he'd played with, elders who'd taught him survival strategies, all of them were suffering because of his actions. He told himself that the system itself was responsible, not him, that the cruelty of collective punishment was Whitmore's choice, not his. But the rationalization didn't fully ease the weight of knowing that his bid for freedom was causing others to suffer. The psychological pressure was mounting. Sarah's breathing had become labored, whether from the poor air quality or from stress-induced respiratory distress, Isaac couldn't tell. Benjamin had developed a cough that he struggled to suppress, each stifled eruption threatening to give away their position, and Isaac himself was fighting waves of claustrophobia so intense they made him want to scream, to burst from the hiding place even if it meant capture, anything to escape the coffin-like confinement. But they endured. Hour after hour they maintained their silence and stillness, drawing on reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed. On the afternoon of the second day, something shifted. Isaac heard Josiah Marks's voice again, this time in conversation with Master Holloway near the barn, close enough that every word was audible through the ventilation gap. "I can't wait any longer," Marks was saying, his voice tight with frustration. "I've got other business to attend to, other properties to transport. Every day I sit here waiting is money lost. I'm cutting my losses and leaving tomorrow morning." "What about the money you paid for them?" Holloway demanded. "What about it? I paid you $3,300 for property you can't deliver. I want a refund or I want replacement slaves of equivalent value." The argument that followed was heated, with Marks demanding his money back and Holloway insisting that the contract was fulfilled when ownership transferred, that recovering the escaped slaves was now Marks's problem, not his. The legal technicalities of slave trading washed over Isaac, but the crucial information was clear. Marks was leaving. The sale that was supposed to tear their family apart was falling through. This should have been cause for celebration, but Isaac's analytical mind immediately saw the complications. If Marks left without them, Holloway would still be in debt. He would still need to sell them to cover his losses.
The moment they were recaptured, they'd be sold again, possibly to someone even worse than the original buyers. The escape hadn't solved the fundamental problem, it had merely delayed it.
Unless they could wait until the search intensity decreased further, until the plantation relaxed its vigilance, and then make their actual run for freedom. But that would require enduring more days in this hiding place, more days of hunger and cold and cramped darkness. Could they survive that? Could their bodies and minds hold out long enough to see the plan through to completion? That night, as they huddled together for warmth, Isaac felt his mother's hand find his in the darkness and squeeze with a strength that surprised him. She leaned close to his ear and whispered so quietly that only he could hear, "Proud of you, so proud." Those 4 words, spoken at tremendous risk, gave Isaac the strength to continue. His mother's pride, his father's trust, the knowledge that they were still together, still a family, still free in the only way that truly mattered, these things were worth any suffering. But the next day would bring a test of that conviction that would push all of them to their absolute limits. Day 3 began with a sound that made Isaac's blood run cold. Dogs barking, very close and heading in their direction. Not the general sounds of search parties that they'd been hearing for 2 days, but focused, determined barking that suggested the dogs had found a scent trail, had locked on to something. Isaac's mind raced. Had they left some trace he hadn't accounted for? Had the ventilation gap carried their scent to where dogs could detect it? Had someone informed on them, guessing where they might be hiding? The dogs came closer, their handlers shouting encouragement, the sound of multiple men moving through the woods around the tobacco barn. Isaac, Sarah, and Benjamin pressed themselves against the earth floor of their hiding place, making themselves as small and still as possible, barely breathing. The barn door crashed open above them. Footsteps thundered on the floorboards directly over their heads, so close that dust filtered down through the cracks, that they could hear the individual words of the searchers. "Dogs are going crazy," a voice said, not Whitmore, but one of the slave catchers who'd been hired to help with the search. "It's just rats and old tobacco. This barn's full of vermin. Dogs probably smell some dead animal." But the first man wasn't convinced. "Help me check these boards. Some of them look loose." Isaac heard footsteps moving around the barn's interior, heard the scrape of boots on wood, heard the searchers testing floorboards with their feet, looking for any that might conceal a hiding place. They were going to be found. After 3 days of successful hiding, after enduring conditions that would have broken most people, after coming so close to making the plan work, they were going to be discovered because of dogs and a searcher who was more thorough than his companions. Isaac felt his mother's hand tighten on his, felt her body trembling with either fear or cold or both. He wanted to tell her he was sorry, that he'd tried his best, that at least they'd spent these last days together rather than being separated by sail. But he couldn't speak, couldn't risk giving away their position even now. The footsteps stopped directly above their hiding place. The searcher's voice, "This section here feels different. Hand me that pry bar." This was it, the end of the escape attempt, the end of their freedom dream, the beginning of whatever terrible punishment Whitmore would devise for slaves who dared to run and caused so much trouble. But then, a miracle. Another voice, louder, calling from outside the barn. "We got them! Found tracks heading toward the river. Fresh ones. They must have circled back this way. Everyone to the river." The footsteps above them paused. "You sure?" "Whitmore says get to the river now. They're tracking them across the water." The footsteps moved away quickly, the searchers abandoning the barn to join what they thought was the actual pursuit. The door slammed. The sounds receded. Isaac, Sarah, and Benjamin remained motionless, not trusting this reprieve, understanding that it could be a trick, that the searchers might return any moment. But minutes passed, then an hour, and the barn remained empty and silent, except for the sound of their own labored breathing. Later, Isaac would understand what had happened.
Some other enslaved person, or perhaps multiple people, had created a false trail to draw the searchers away from the barn, had risked their own safety to protect 3 people trying to escape. It was the kind of solidarity, the kind of mutual aid that existed beneath the surface of plantation life, invisible to the masters, but absolutely vital to survival and resistance. Someone had saved them. Someone had given them a chance to continue, to see this plan through to its conclusion. But that conclusion was still uncertain. How much longer could they endure? When would it be safe to emerge and make their actual escape? The false alarm at the barn changed the dynamic of the search. Isaac could hear in the voices of the searchers a growing frustration, a sense that they were chasing ghosts, that the fugitives were somehow always one step ahead. Whitmore's voice grew hoarse from shouting orders. The dogs seemed confused by the multiple false trails. The searchers began to argue among themselves about strategy and direction. Master Holloway, meanwhile, had apparently written off the escaped slaves as a loss. Isaac heard him telling Marks that he would take the financial hit, would not pursue the fugitives beyond a reasonable search period, would instead focus on tightening security to prevent future escapes. The calculation was purely economic. The cost of an extended search was exceeding the value of the property being searched for. This was exactly what Isaac had gambled on.
The system of slavery was, at its core, an economic system. When the economics didn't make sense, when recovering fugitives cost more than they were worth, the system had built-in limits on how aggressively it would pursue them. On the 4th day of hiding, the search was called off. The plantation returned to normal operations, though with increased security measures and a palpable tension among both the enslaved population and the white overseers. Patrols continued, but they were routine rather than intensive. The dogs were sent home. The hired slave catchers departed, grumbling about time wasted and money lost. Isaac, Sarah, and Benjamin had endured 4 days in the hiding place. 4 days that felt like 4 months, that had tested every aspect of their physical and mental endurance. They were weak from hunger, having consumed their meager supplies. They were dehydrated, despite carefully rationing their water. They were sick from the poor air quality and the stress and the cramped conditions. But they were still together. They were still free in the way that mattered. And now, finally, it was time for the second phase of the plan, the actual escape. They waited until the middle of the 5th night, giving the plantation time to fully relax its vigilance, giving themselves time to recover just enough strength for what was to come. Then Isaac carefully lifted the floorboards that concealed their hiding place, and they emerged into the barn's interior like people rising from graves. The fresh air, even the musty air of the abandoned barn, was like water to drowning victims. They stood slowly, their muscles screaming from days of immobility, their joints stiff and painful. Sarah could barely stand without Benjamin's support. Isaac's legs threatened to buckle under him. But they were out. They were moving. Phase 2 could begin. Isaac had used the days of hiding to refine his escape route in his mind, to think through every step of the journey they were about to attempt. They wouldn't head north as everyone expected. They would head southeast toward the James River, following it downstream toward Richmond, but then cutting south toward Petersburg, and eventually to the coast, where Isaac had learned from newspapers that communities of free black people existed, where there were connections to the Underground Railroad's eastern routes. It was a longer journey than heading north, but it would take them through areas where the search wouldn't be concentrated, where they might pass as enslaved people traveling with legitimate passes that Isaac had been preparing to forge using materials he'd been collecting for months. They gathered their strength, ate the last of their cached supplies, drank deeply from a rain barrel beside the barn to rehydrate and prepare for the journey. Then, just before midnight, they set out. The plantation was quiet, the patrols predictable in their routes, the night dark enough to hide their movement, but light enough to navigate by. They moved like shadows, like spirits, like people who had learned that survival sometimes meant becoming invisible. They reached the plantation's eastern boundary without incident and crossed into the woods beyond, officially still on plantation property, but in an area rarely patrolled. They kept moving, putting miles between themselves and the plantation that had been their prison, between themselves and the system that had tried to tear them apart. As dawn approached and they reached a thicket deep in the woods where they could hide during the day and rest, Isaac allowed himself, for the first time in 5 days, to feel something like hope. They had done it. They had hidden in plain sight, had outsmarted the slave catchers, had kept their family together against impossible odds. They still had a long journey ahead, still faced countless dangers, but they had proven something essential, that intelligence could overcome brute force, that careful planning could defeat a system designed to prevent exactly what they'd just accomplished, that 3 people who loved each other could find strength even in the darkest circumstances. But could they maintain this success? Could they complete the journey to freedom? Or would their escape be cut short just when they dared to hope? The journey south and east toward the coast was a study in strategic movement and constant adaptation. Isaac had studied maps in newspapers, had memorized the geography of Virginia as best he could from fragments of information gathered over years. But theoretical knowledge was different from actual navigation through hostile territory, where every white face was a potential threat, where every encounter could end in capture or death. They traveled by night and hid by day, using the skills that enslaved people had developed over generations of survival and resistance. Sarah's experience moving silently through the master's house translated to moving silently through woods and fields. And Isaac's analytical mind continually assessed risks, planned routes, created contingency strategies for different scenarios. The forged passes Isaac had prepared proved invaluable. He'd created 3 documents that claimed they were enslaved workers being hired out to a Petersburg merchant, traveling under the supervision of an overseer who had ridden ahead to prepare lodging. The passes were crude forgeries that wouldn't stand up to close scrutiny, but they were sufficient for brief encounters with patrols who weren't inclined to look too closely.
They used these passes twice in the first week of travel, both times successfully talking their way past white men who could have raised alarms, but instead accepted the fiction that Isaac presented with a confidence he didn't truly feel. The journey was hard in ways that their hiding had been hard, but different. Instead of confinement and stillness, they faced exhaustion and exposure. Instead of hunger managed by rationing meager supplies, they faced hunger complicated by the need to forage while staying hidden. Instead of the psychological torture of forced silence, they faced the constant fear of discovery, the knowledge that every step took them farther from the familiar and deeper into unknown territory. But they also experienced something they'd never known before: autonomy. For the first time in their lives, they made their own decisions about where to go, when to rest, what risks to take. The decisions often felt impossible. The choices frequently seemed to be between bad options and worse ones, but they were their decisions, their choices, their lives to navigate. On the 9th day of their escape, they encountered other fugitives. A young woman named Clara, who had escaped from a plantation near Petersburg after her children were sold away, and an older man named Moses, who had been running for 3 weeks, heading north but willing to change directions if he could find a safer route. The meeting was tense at first, each group wary of the other, but Isaac's mother Sarah recognized in Clara a grief that matched her own, and the connection was made. Moses had experience that Isaac lacked. He'd attempted escape twice before, been caught both times, survived punishments that should have killed him.
His knowledge of the Underground Railroad's networks of safe houses and Quaker contacts, of the methods slave catchers used and how to avoid them, was invaluable. "You're heading towards Suffolk," Moses told them when Isaac explained their planned route. "There's a community there, free black folks who help runaways, but there's also slave catchers who know fugitives sometimes head that way. You got to be smart about approaching." The group of 5 continued together, their combined skills and knowledge making them stronger than they would have been separately. Moses taught them techniques for avoiding dogs, walking through water, masking their scent with strong-smelling plants, doubling back to create confusing trails. Clara, despite her grief, proved resourceful at finding food and creating believable stories when they needed to interact with people. They were becoming something more than individual fugitives. They were becoming a community of resistance, a small band of people who had chosen freedom over safety, who supported each other through challenges that would have broken them if faced alone. But the journey was far from over, and the greatest test of Isaac's planning was still ahead.
3 weeks into their escape, they reached the outskirts of Suffolk, the coastal town that Moses had identified as their best chance for making contact with the Underground Railroad. The town was a complex mix of free black people, enslaved people, poor whites, merchants, and sailors, a place where fugitives could potentially blend in, but also where slave catchers operated, knowing that escapees often headed toward ports where they might stow away on northbound ships. Isaac's plan required them to make contact with a free black minister who Moses said ran a church that secretly helped fugitives. But approaching the church meant entering the town, exposing themselves to scrutiny, risking everything on the hope that Moses's information was accurate and that the minister would help rather than betray them for the reward money that was surely being offered. The decision to trust had to be made collectively. They gathered in a grove outside town and discussed their options. They could try to continue on their own, heading farther south along the coast, hoping to find other opportunities. They could attempt to steal a boat and try to sail north, though none of them had significant sailing experience. Or they could take the risk of trusting the minister, gambling everything on the hope that there were people in the world who would help strangers seeking freedom. "I'm tired," Sarah said simply, her voice carrying a weight of exhaustion that went beyond the physical. "I'm tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being afraid every moment. If this minister is who Moses says he is, if he can help us find a real path to freedom, then I think we have to try. If he betrays us—" She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "Then we at least tried," Benjamin finished for her. "We at least reached for something better, rather than just running until we couldn't run anymore." Clara and Moses both agreed. They were all exhausted, all pushed beyond normal human limits, all desperate for a solution that didn't involve endless flight. Isaac, the youngest of them, but the de facto leader because of his planning and intelligence, made the final decision. "We go to the church, but we go carefully. We watch first, we observe, we make sure it feels right before we commit ourselves, and we have an escape route planned if things go wrong." That evening, as the sun set over Suffolk, Isaac approached the church alone while the others waited in hiding. He'd volunteered for this role because he was the youngest, the least threatening, the most likely to be helped if the minister was truly sympathetic to runaways. If it was a trap, his capture might not doom the others. They could still run while the slave catchers focused on him. The church was a simple wooden structure in the free black section of town, modest but well-maintained, with lamplight visible through the windows.
Isaac waited until full darkness, until the town had settled into evening routines. Then he approached the back door and knocked. The man who answered was in his 50s, tall and dignified, with gray in his hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through to Isaac's soul. "Yes, child?" he said, his voice gentle but cautious. "Are you Reverend Collins?" Isaac asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am. And who might you be?" someone who needs help, someone who was told you might offer it to people like me." The Reverend's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flash of understanding, of recognition. "Come inside, quickly," he said, glancing around to make sure no one had seen Isaac's approach. Inside, the Reverend listened to Isaac's story with a stillness that suggested deep attention. When Isaac finished, the Reverend was quiet for a long moment. "You're 12 years old," he finally said, "and you planned and executed an escape that kept your family together, that used deception and strategy rather than just blind flight, that brought you safely across 3 weeks of hostile territory. That's remarkable, child, remarkable and slightly terrifying." "Will you help us?" Isaac asked directly, "or should I run now before you turn us in?" Reverend Collins smiled, a sad smile that held understanding of Isaac's fear and his courage. "I'll help you. I've been helping people like you for 10 years now, and I'll keep helping until this evil system finally falls. You and your family and your friends are safe here for now. We'll get you fed, rested, and then we'll get you on the next stage of the journey north." Could it be real? Could they actually have found safety after so long running and hiding? Or was this a trap more sophisticated than Isaac's intelligence could detect? Reverend Collins proved true to his word. Over the next 3 days, Isaac and his family, along with Clara and Moses, rested in the church's hidden basement, a space specifically designed to conceal fugitives from slave catchers. They ate real meals for the first time in weeks, slept in actual beds, began to recover from the physical and psychological trauma of their escape. The Reverend explained the route north, the network of safe houses and sympathetic conductors that made up the Underground Railroad in Virginia's coastal regions. You'll travel by wagon hidden under false floors, sometimes in the holds of ships, sometimes walking at night between stations. It'll still be dangerous. Slave catchers watch these routes, and there are informers even among free black people who'll betray fugitives for money. But you'll have help, support, people who believe in your right to freedom. Isaac listened carefully, memorizing every detail, understanding that his role as planner and strategist wasn't finished just because they'd reached this temporary safety. The journey north would require continued vigilance, continued adaptation to changing circumstances. On the 4th night in Suffolk, the group was awakened by urgent knocking on the basement door. Reverend Collins entered, his face tight with worry. Slave catchers in town, asking about recent runaways. Someone must have informed. You need to leave tonight, earlier than planned. The rushed departure was chaotic but organized by the Reverend's experience. They were loaded into a wagon owned by a Quaker merchant who traded along the coast, hidden in a specially constructed compartment beneath the wagon bed. The space was cramped but less confining than their hiding place on the plantation had been, perhaps because they now knew this was temporary, that they were moving toward freedom rather than just hiding from recapture. The wagon journey took them north through a series of stops, a farm outside Norfolk where a free black family fed them and gave them fresh clothing, a warehouse in Portsmouth where they hid for 2 days while slave catchers searched the area, a ship's hold in Hampton where a sympathetic captain agreed to transport them to Maryland as part of his legitimate cargo. Each transition brought new risks and new moments where discovery seemed imminent. Isaac's forged passes were used again, supplemented now by documents provided by Underground Railroad conductors. His ability to quickly assess situations, to adapt his story to different audiences, to present confidence even when terrified, proved essential again and again. Sarah's dignity and composure helped convince people that they were legitimate travelers rather than fugitives.
Benjamin's quiet strength and mechanical skills made him valuable to the people who helped them, creating relationships of mutual benefit rather than just charity. Clara's knowledge of household work helped her gain temporary employment that provided cover for their presence in various locations, and Moses's experience with the routes and dangers became increasingly vital as they moved through territory he'd navigated before. They were becoming something more than fugitives. They were becoming participants in a resistance network that spanned states and involved hundreds of people risking everything to undermine the slave system. Each person who helped them was making a choice to defy law, to risk their own freedom or safety, to assert that human freedom mattered more than property rights or legal codes. 2 months after leaving the Holloway plantation, after countless close calls and moments of despair, after trials that had tested every aspect of their endurance and ingenuity, Isaac and his family crossed into Pennsylvania, a free state where slavery was illegal, where they could not be legally returned to bondage. The moment of crossing was less dramatic than Isaac had imagined. There was no clear marker, no sudden change in landscape.
They simply walked across a field on a November morning, a Quaker guide telling them, "You're free now. You're in Pennsylvania. You're safe." Safe. Free. Words that had been theoretical concepts, dreams whispered in darkness, impossible goals that drove them forward. Now they were reality. Benjamin collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his face, his powerful hands clutching the free soil. Sarah stood motionless, her face upturned to the sky as if seeing the sun for the first time. Clara wept openly, grieving the children she'd lost, but grateful to be alive and free to grieve them openly. Moses, who had attempted this journey 3 times and finally succeeded, laughed with a joy that was profound and contagious. And Isaac, 12 years old, who had planned and executed an escape that preserved his family, that brought 5 people from bondage to freedom, that proved intelligence and love could overcome even the most oppressive system, Isaac felt a complex mix of emotions too vast to name. But was this truly the end, or just the beginning of a different kind of challenge? The reality of freedom was more complex than the dream of it had been. Isaac and his family settled in Philadelphia, joining a community of formerly enslaved people who were building new lives in freedom. The Quakers who had helped them escape continued to help them adjust, finding Benjamin work as a blacksmith, Sarah work as a seamstress, and Isaac enrollment in a school for black children where his intelligence could finally be formally educated. But freedom came with its own challenges. They lived in constant fear that slave catchers might kidnap them and return them south, a legitimate fear since the fugitive slave law made even free states unsafe for escapees. They struggled with poverty in a society that offered limited economic opportunities to black people even in the North. They carried trauma from years of enslavement that didn't simply disappear because they'd crossed a border. Isaac, in particular, struggled with what might be called survivor's guilt. He thought constantly about the people still enslaved on the Holloway plantation, about the collective punishment they'd suffered because of his escape, about Samuel and the other children growing up in bondage. His freedom felt incomplete knowing that millions remained enslaved. But he also understood that his freedom could be a form of resistance in itself, that living well, learning, contributing to the free black community was a way of proving that enslaved people were fully human, fully capable of everything that white people were capable of. He threw himself into education with a passion that amazed his teachers, absorbing knowledge like he'd once absorbed information about the plantation's operations. By age 15, Isaac was working with abolitionists, speaking at meetings about his experiences, helping to plan escapes for others still in bondage. His intelligence and strategic thinking that had saved his family now served a larger cause. He became one of the youngest conductors on the Underground Railroad, using his experience to help others navigate the journey he'd taken. His mother, Sarah, became a vocal advocate for enslaved families, speaking at churches and meetings about the systematic destruction of black families that slavery required. Her dignity and eloquence changed minds, convinced people who'd been indifferent about slavery to become actively opposed to it. His father's Benjamin's blacksmith shop became a station on the Underground Railroad, a place where fugitives could find temporary work and shelter while planning their next moves north. Clara, who'd lost her children to slavery, dedicated herself to helping other mothers reunite with children who'd been sold away, working with networks of informants and sympathizers to track families and facilitate reunions when possible. And Moses, the experienced fugitive who'd helped them reach safety, became a legendary conductor on the Underground Railroad, personally leading dozens of enslaved people to freedom over the next decade. The escape that had begun with a 12-year-old boy's desperate plan to keep his family together had grown into something larger, a contribution to the growing resistance movement that would eventually help bring down the entire system of slavery. Years later, when Isaac was an old man watching the end of slavery finally come through the Civil War and emancipation, he would think back to those 5 days hiding beneath the tobacco barn's floorboards, to the 3 weeks of desperate flight through hostile territory, to the moment when he'd knocked on Reverend Collins's door and gambled everything on trust. He would think about the intelligence that had saved him, not just his own intelligence, but the collective intelligence of enslaved people who had developed survival strategies over generations, who had created networks of resistance and mutual aid, who had proven again and again that bondage could not destroy the human capacity for thought, planning, creativity, and hope. And he would think about love, the love that had made a 12-year-old boy willing to risk everything to keep his family together, the love that had sustained them through trials that should have broken them, the love that had driven strangers to help fugitives at tremendous personal risk. Intelligence and love. These were the forces that defeated slavery, not just in his case, but in the cases of thousands of escapees, millions of acts of resistance, countless moments of courage, small and large, that accumulated until the system could no longer sustain itself. The story of Isaac's escape eventually became part of the oral tradition of the formerly enslaved community, passed down through generations.
The details would change in various tellings. Sometimes he was younger, sometimes older. Sometimes the hiding place was described differently. Sometimes other characters were added or removed. But the essential truth remained. A brilliant young boy had outsmarted the slave system, had used his intelligence as a weapon against oppression, had proven that the human mind could not be enslaved even when the human body was. His story joined thousands of other escape stories, each one unique, each one a testament to courage and cunning, each one a brick in the wall of resistance that eventually brought slavery down. In the years after emancipation, when formerly enslaved people were interviewed and their testimonies recorded for history, Isaac was among them. He was asked to explain his planning process, to describe his strategy, to reflect on what had made his escape successful when so many others failed. "I was lucky," he always said, downplaying his own role. "Lucky that my mother taught me to read. Lucky that my father taught me to observe and analyze. Lucky that we had a few days to hide before we had to run. Lucky that good people helped us along the way. Luck more than intelligence." But those who knew him, who understood what he'd accomplished, recognized this for what it was: humility and also a deeper truth. Because intelligence without opportunity is useless. Courage without support is often suicidal, and individual action without community is rarely enough to overcome systemic oppression. Isaac had been intelligent, yes, but he'd also been part of a community that preserved and transmitted knowledge across generations, that created networks of resistance, that maintained hope in circumstances designed to destroy it. His escape was both individual and collective, both a unique story and part of a larger narrative of resistance. The night before he died, at age 73, Isaac called his children and grandchildren to his bedside. He told them the story one more time, not the sanitized version he told to white audiences at abolitionist meetings, but the full story, with all its fear and doubt and desperation. He told them about the 5 days in the hiding place, about the moment when slave catchers had stood directly above them, testing the floorboards, about the terror of the journey and the joy of freedom. "Why are you telling us this now?" his youngest granddaughter asked. "You've told this story before." "Because I want you to understand something," Isaac said, his old voice still carrying echoes of the brilliant boy he'd been. "The system of slavery was designed to make us believe we were less than human, that we were incapable of the kind of thinking and planning that white people did. Every time an enslaved person escaped, every time someone used their intelligence to survive and resist, it was proof that the whole system was built on a lie." He paused, gathering strength. "You were born free.
You'll never know what it was like to be property, but you need to know that your freedom wasn't given, it was taken by people who refused to accept bondage, who used every tool they had, intelligence, courage, love, faith, to break the chains. You need to know this because freedom isn't permanent. Every generation has to defend it, has to use their intelligence to identify and resist new forms of oppression, has to have the courage to stand up even when standing is dangerous. You need to know this because the story of our people isn't a story of victimhood. It's a story of resistance, of intelligence, of refusing to be defined by other people's hatreds and limitations. Remember that. Remember where you came from. Remember that you carry in your blood the courage of people who fought for freedom, even knowing they might die for it. Remember, and live lives worthy of their sacrifice." Those were among Isaac's last words. He died peacefully in his sleep that night, surrounded by family, in a country where slavery had ended, but where the struggle for true equality continued. His funeral was attended by hundreds, formerly enslaved people whose own escapes he'd helped facilitate, abolitionists who'd worked alongside him, children he'd taught, people whose lives had been touched by his example and his work. They told stories about him, stories of his brilliant strategies, his tireless work for freedom, his generosity with others seeking to escape. And they told the story of a 12-year-old boy who'd refused to accept the destruction of his family, who'd used his mind as a weapon against a system designed to keep him powerless, who'd proven that human intelligence and love were stronger than chains and whips and legal codes that defined people as property. In the end, what was Isaac's story really about? On one level, it was about a specific historical event, one family's escape from slavery in Virginia in 1851. But on a deeper level, it was about something universal and timeless, the human capacity to resist oppression through intelligence, planning, creativity, and mutual aid. Isaac's story reminds us that the enslaved were not passive victims waiting for white abolitionists to free them. They were active agents in their own liberation, using every tool available to them: cunning, deception, strategic thinking, community networks, spiritual resilience to fight for freedom. It reminds us that intelligence takes many forms. Isaac's intelligence wasn't measured by formal tests or validated by degrees. He'd received only fragments of education in secret, taught himself to read from a stolen Bible, learned strategy and planning through observation and necessity. But that intelligence was no less real, no less powerful by being forged in the crucible of oppression rather than the comfort of privilege. It reminds us that family and community are worth fighting for, worth risking everything to preserve.
Isaac could have tried to escape alone. 12-year-old boys were sometimes successful fugitives because they could move quickly and hide easily. But he chose to keep his family together, even though it made the escape infinitely more difficult. That choice reflected values that slavery tried to destroy but couldn't. The value of love over individual survival, of togetherness over safety, of human connection over mere existence. It reminds us that systems of oppression, no matter how powerful they seem, have vulnerabilities. The slave system depended on assumed white superiority, on the belief that enslaved people couldn't think strategically or plan effectively. Every time that assumption was proven false, the system was weakened. Isaac's successful escape was one small crack in a seemingly impregnable wall, but enough small cracks eventually bring down any wall. And it reminds us that freedom is not a destination, but a journey. Not a single moment of crossing a border, but a continuous process of claiming and defending human dignity. Isaac's freedom didn't end his struggles, it transformed them. He spent the rest of his life fighting for the freedom of others, working to build a society where his freedom wouldn't be exceptional but universal. These lessons transcend the specific historical context of American slavery. They apply wherever people face oppression, wherever systems try to dehumanize some humans for the benefit of others, wherever courage and intelligence are required to resist injustice. Isaac's story is our inheritance. It belongs to his descendants in a direct sense, but it also belongs to anyone who believes in human dignity, who recognizes that freedom is worth fighting for, who understands that intelligence and love are the most powerful forces available to people facing overwhelming odds. We honor Isaac and the millions of others who resisted slavery, not just by remembering them, but by continuing their work, by identifying the injustices of our own time, by using our intelligence and resources to resist them, by building communities of mutual aid and resistance, by refusing to accept anyone's dehumanization. This is what ancestors like Isaac ask of us, not worship, not pity, but continuation. Continue the fight for freedom. Continue using intelligence to resist oppression. Continue valuing human dignity above comfort or safety. Continue building the world they died dreaming of, but never got to see. Remember Isaac, the 12-year-old boy who outsmarted the slave system and saved his family. Remember his intelligence, his courage, his love. Remember that you, too, can face seemingly impossible odds and find a way through, that you, too, have the power to resist systems designed to keep you powerless. Remember, and in remembering, become worthy inheritors of such a legacy.
If this story of courage, intelligence, and family love moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with others. These are the stories that history tried to erase, but they survive in memory, in testimony, in the legacy of resistance that continues today. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories that celebrate the brilliance and courage of those who fought for freedom against impossible odds. The story of Isaac is not just history, it's a reminder of what humans are capable of when pushed to extremes, when love demands action, when intelligence finds its purpose in resistance. His story is a light in the darkness, proving that even in systems designed to crush the human spirit, that spirit finds ways to survive, to resist, to ultimately triumph.
Remember his name. Remember his courage. Remember that the same capacity for intelligence, love, and resistance that he demonstrated lives in all of us, waiting for the moment when it's needed, when we face our own trials and must decide whether to accept injustice or fight for something better. Remember Isaac and live lives worthy of such an ancestor.